Ahaw migwech apiji and enimiguan bajayan, kawe gita winda munanim awian, wagosh, indigu minawa migizi indo dame, wasawadi ushkonigan wenjabayan, gazaga squaji mekag, namanji dogish benisro taguan ojabwemoyan. English 2. All right. Thanks for coming out today. I'm looking forward to having a great conversation with all of you. Please think about what questions you might have for me, because we're going to hold some of our space for fielding questions and just having a conversation. I thought maybe by way of introduction, I would share a couple things to get us started. After all, nobody sees the world the way that it is. We all see the world the way that we are, and we are all a little bit different. So I first started with a brief shout out in the Ojibwe language. Ojibwe and Dakota are the indigenous languages of Minnesota, and I am heartened to be in your company. This is a tough time, I think, in the history of the world, in our country, for so many reasons. And they include things like climate change, but also what's going on in our political space and race relations. And, you know, the diversity is here to stay. There's no way around that. Doesn't matter who's in charge. But there are a lot of people who don't seem committed to figuring out how to get along, much less get us all in the same canoe. Here's an Ojibwe metaphor, paddling in the same direction to go somewhere. So it's important to have real conversations about real things. I'm almost to the point, I work at Bemidji State University, I'm almost to the point now where I have the president and deans convinced that if somebody calls to ask for the Department of Foreign Languages, to send them to the English department. And if somebody wants anything else, they can come see me. It's important, though, to think about some of these things. There's a gentleman here, I can show you a couple slides as we go. It's not a PowerPoint heavy project here, but make sure I hit the right arrows. This is the late, great Tom Stillday. It's interesting, he was the first person who was named chaplain for the Minnesota State Senate who was not from a religion that came from across the ocean. So colonization is about taking one language, culture, religion, and using it to supplant others. It's kind of been about erasure, and that's kind of evidence of it, right? You would think that what was here for tens of thousands of years prior to that would have somehow been centered in the enterprise. But he was hilarious too. That was him with his pipe opening up the state Senate. He would say, "I'm praying for politicians. Boy, do they need it." And that was even before the stuff we've seen, you know, in more recent years. We also had him at our university for a graduation banquet speech for our Native students, which I always fondly remember because I'd been asking them to bring him in. And finally, they relented because, you know, he wasn't really an academic guy. I said, he's got a PhD in the School of Life. He'll have all kinds of great things to share. So finally, they brought him in. I had to pull Tom to the side and say, "Tom, have you ever seen a TED Talk?" He's like, "Nope." I'm like, Well, think 12 minutes, throw in a good joke or two, focus on the students. He said, "Got it." Got up there, he spoke for an hour and a half straight. He did it all in Ojibwe, even though we're in mixed company. And then when he was all done, he said only one line in English, which was, "All you people who study Indians, study that." And he went and sat down. So I thought, great presentation. But he had some good points. Like most of the books that had been written about Native people were written by non-Native people who hadn't even talked to one of us or spent time in one of our places. That wasn't like Native lit or Native history. That was like the white man's Indian. And that's been changing in recent years. But it wasn't just the history books. It was everything. It was like the suicide prevention plan, the substance abuse intervention plan, the economic development plan, you name it, school turnaround plan. They're looking at data sets. Native people aren't even included in the data sets. And then they're scratching their heads why this data-based idea is not delivering the same results. And there's so many things. I think there's a growing awareness that like one size doesn't fit all, that there's a danger to taking all of the different shaped blocks and trying to pound them through the square peg hole, so to speak, for all of us humans. Like If you're in education, for the kids who are coming through your door, some are visual learners, some are auditory learners, some are kinetic and need to get up and do stuff. But it's with all of the different things. To be adaptable, to be able to meet people where they are at so we can go on a journey together, it takes some practice. Yeah. So Tom, he had some good things to share with us. There's home right there, Leech Lake, epicenter of the universe. Not everybody knows I'm on a mission to share. Here's a couple folks from my family tree. Check out this guy. It's ironic he got the name John Smith later in life. No connection to the one from Pocahontas mythology. Are most of you aware that what you saw on Disney is complete mythology? Yeah, okay. If you want a sidebar on that, or when we get to questions, if you're like, could you recap that Pocahontas stuff? I'd like to know a little more. I'm happy to go there too. But this guy was born in the late 1700s. He died in 1922. Lived in parts of 3 centuries. Among the lessons, you can't put a price on eat right and exercise. But the dude had to know stuff. He was here in Minnesota when it was all native space. And he was here when the soldiers came back from World War I. Must have seen some things. And then this guy, next to him, Wabujig, was kind of a famous warrior in the Ojibwe world. These are folks that most Minnesotans wouldn't even know much about. And that started to bother me. It's like, these guys are worth studying. Like, how do you live in 3 centuries? Wouldn't we all want to know, And I didn't really have tools to talk about it when I was a kid, but as I got older, it started to bother me more that I could go to school for 13 years in a row, K-12, to learn whatever I needed to be successful in the world, and none of it had anything to do with me. It was kind of like there was a message. And no one was like, there were times when people were overtly mean, but most of the time it was the absent narratives that were screaming at me, you and yours aren't important, aren't relevant, don't matter. Because if we were important, relevant, or mattered, somebody would have said something in 13 years of an education. And this is one of the great challenges with a big country of 330 million people and every kind of diversity you could imagine, is how do we hold each other up and learn about one another and respect one another? And in my view, when you learn about someone or something, then it sparks your natural curiosity and you naturally humanize whoever you're bumping into. It's why when there's a new war, there's usually some new racial slur for whoever we're fighting. Intentionally so, to dehumanize us. And the educational system is part of the problem. It really is. Like, you can go to school in this country and be taught way more about animals in the big, broad British Empire than the animals right here in Minnesota. So much so that we can be cruising down the highway and see some little brown animal run over by a car and be like, no idea what that is. But a duck-billed platypus, yep. Zebra, yep. Giraffe, yep. Not that we shouldn't know the details of the duck-billed platypus. Power to you. But to have complete ignorance about what is a mink. Because when you don't know something or someone, it's so much easier to be ambivalent about or complicit in its destruction. What are we doing to Mother Nature? What are we doing to each other? So there's kind of a lot at stake with, the stories we tell. Although some people bristle when we use words like white privilege, really what that means, if you think about it, it's not simply things like economic advantage, but like if you're white and you're going to school K-12 in America, you'll most likely get a teacher from your own racial group at some point in the journey. It's even possible that you might only have teachers from your racial group. And if you're from a minoritized population, you might never have an educator from your own racial group. And it's not just who's doing the teaching, but the stories that are being taught, the stories about who helped make this country or this world an awesome place, or what have you. So the narrative will either positively reinforce through those stories or negatively reinforce through the absence of those stories. So we got to figure out a way to share bandwidth so that we can hold them all up. And that too is something that takes some careful thought. And a lot of people are working on it, and I do see progress. A little bit about me. Sometimes it surprises people because I'm kind of brown or brownish, and braids or man bun today, some beads. That my father wasn't native at all. He was an Austrian Jewish immigrant and a survivor of the Nazi Holocaust. He spoke beautiful German. He had 300 family members killed. Made it out of there at age 13. Made it to the United States at age 14. Lied about his age at age 17, signed up for the US Army. World War II was still going. Served at age 17 in the US Army. And I think he wanted to kill Nazis, but they sent him to the Pacific Theater instead. He was in the Philippines. Oops. Eventually, he made his way to Minnesota. He met my mom, and here I am. So that's the very short version. Feel free when we do get to the questions to ask about personal things as well as professional things. It's all on the table, wherever you want to go. By the way, maybe a little more than a sidebar, there's an ongoing debate inside Native communities about who's Native and who decides. The Native population has the highest rate of marriage to people from outside groups. So the Native population is especially multiracial. What that means is some Native folks look black, some look white, some look brown, some look racially ambiguous, and you can't tell just by looking. And although human beings have invented the concept of race, like it's just, one race, the human race, but this thing that humans invented is now a pretty good predictor for who's being disciplined in school, who's graduating from school, which police officers in Minneapolis are being racially profiled by ICE, all this kind of stuff. So it's like we do have to pay attention to this thing that we should not have to pay attention to get to the point where we don't have to pay attention to it. And although humans invented this thing, we keep changing the rules. So sometimes this sounds crazy to people in Minnesota, but initially the Irish were considered not white. Most Minnesotans today think, what could be whiter than being Irish? Sounds ridiculous, but they were treated as second-class citizens in the United States because there was a very Anglo-Saxon definition of whiteness. But eventually that definition expanded to include the Irish. Then the United States considered Italians not white and passed special laws to stop those not white people from coming here. And then the definition changed to fold Italians into whiteness. The 2010 census put Hispanic/Latino as a separate category amongst racial categories on the census. And you had to pick either or. Black, white, American Indian / Alaskan Native / Pacific Islander, even though those are all different things too, or Hispanic / Latino. The 2020 census, if you clicked Hispanic / Latino, you get a drop-down menu. And then you could pick something else. They switched it from a racial category to an ethnic category, which is more accurate. If you just Look at your TV and turn on your brain for a second. The Dominican Republic, predominantly Black, official language is Spanish. Argentina, one of a number of South American countries that is whiter than America. Whiter than America. You know? And so, like, the Spanish-speaking population is racially diverse. So we're shifting that right now. And among other things, it will pull some of that population into whiteness, preserving a white racial majority in our racial caste system. That's happening right now. So it's complex. I would offer you this: race is partially about color because you got no choice over how you get othered by other people. Racial profiling is usually first glance. It is partially about culture because maybe the Black Dominican and the white Argentinian, and the brown Mexican have more cultural affinity with one another because they can speak the same language, but then we'll get racially profiled differently driving down the streets. And it's also about consciousness, how we see ourselves. And all of those things are complex and they're all operating all the time. And we're all having a racial experience all the time. You're having one every time you're pulled over, but you're having one every time you are not pulled over too. There's just no flashing sign that says, you were just not racially profiled today. Have a great one. So it's not on our mind. And that's why having the mixed company conversations can be so helpful. All right, there's Dad. Some pictures of Mom. She grew up in a little village called Bena, heart of the Leech Lake Reservation. Population is 400. Half of them are my cousins, no exaggeration. And she had a pretty visceral experience with poverty. She and her siblings would get pulled from school for 2 weeks to go wild rice harvesting, another 2 weeks for hunting, another 2 weeks for fishing, another 2 weeks for the maple harvest. That alone was 8 weeks out of school. All the kids had to help with food production every year. And there are 10,000 tribal members at Leech Lake. She spent her first 18 years on the res. And during her entire childhood, she only met one professional Native person ever. Out of 10,000 people, they couldn't find one to be the banker, the police officer, the teacher. And it was not because none of the people wanted such a job. It was not because none of the people there were capable of doing such a job. It's because even there in a Native space on a reservation, the systems were that successful at excluding Indigenous people from gainful employment, upward mobility, and positions of power. The one person she met, by the way, was a school nurse. And she thought, maybe I could do that. So she finished high school and she went to nursing school, got a nursing degree. First job was working for the tribe's health program. And she came back home and she's like, wow, we're really getting pushed around even here. Enough of that. She went back to school. She got a law degree. She was actually the first female Native attorney in the state of Minnesota. When I was a kid, she would make me come with her to court and she'd say, you just sit there and don't say a word. So, I'd sit there. I didn't say a word. Could not remember her court cases very well. But what I really remember is she was the only woman in court. She and her law partner, Paul Day, they were the only natives in court. And I just came walking out of there thinking, you know what? We can do stuff. That's the D in the DEI. Diversity, representation, role models, and they matter. They really matter. They matter in so many ways. My mom was so smart. She could have been anything she wanted to be. She could only imagine herself being the one thing she had seen another Native person do. And By the way, we just had the retirement celebration for my mom's law partner, Paul Day. They asked me to speak, and I had to tell him, you were the first Native man I ever saw doing something professional. And in the room with us were 300 Native American judges, lawyers, social workers, and educators. I said, look how far we've come. Think how much further we have to go and the incredible impact that even one person can have. There's more to say about that. Could you imagine the all-male gender equity team? Might be missing some vital perspectives and the optics aren't so good. Same's true with the all-white racial equity team. It matters who's in the room and at the table and in positions of power with all the things we do. We all got to love everybody, support everybody. And I was just up at Elk River doing some work in one of the school districts there. There are 70 languages spoken by kids in the district. No one is going to master them all. It's not realistic to expect everyone to be competent in everyone else's culture, but we should at least be curious and exhibit some cultural humility. Like, here's a little bit about what I know. I'm curious about what you know. Let's learn from each other, right? All right. There's more to say about her journey, but I'll push on here so we can get to your questions. The Native experience is complex. So I think we get conditioned, even the Native folks get conditioned to think of the Native experience as trauma, tragedy, poverty, despair, hopelessness, blah. Like, I actually was like at a Rotary thing one time, and some guy's like, hey, I got a question. If it's so bad on a reservation, why don't the Indians just leave? And I was thinking, have you watched the news about the United States of America? If this country is so bad, why doesn't everybody just leave? Could it be that there are some things that are deeply troubling and that do need to be addressed, but that there is also hope, happiness, beauty in the same place? I think so. That's how I think about America. This country saved my dad's life. Also tried to kill my mom. Our foundational promise is genuinely beautiful. Our foundational reality, and the one we're in today, is still full of oppressions. It's all wrapped up in the same star-spangled sandwich. Extra cheese. So I think it's good to be aware that we get conditioned to think of Native people in terms of paternalism and pity. Oh, those poor people. But the reality is complex. So this is just an economic data set. Back in 1969, 57% of the Native population was below the poverty line. 57%. Whoa. Flash forward to 2020 and it was at 23%. Now, 23% of a population below the poverty line is gross. That is unacceptable. That's an indictment on America and its oppressions, not Native people and their lack of a work ethic. It also means we just shaved 34 entire percentage points off of Native poverty, not because of an intervention by the US government. We're still waiting for one of those. That's something Indigenous people engineered for themselves. That should have us all asking, how did they do that? How did they do that? How can we scale that up? How can I ally myself to such worthy efforts? How can we apply those lessons to everybody else in this country? And it can move you from paternalism and pity into partnership. I don't know how many of you have ever had a friend or spouse or whatever, and approached them with paternalism and pity and had it go really well. Even the kids can't take it when their parents talking down to them. You know? It's hard to change everything else in the world, but we can change how we show up. So if we show up, since everyone can smell it, with partnership, as opposed to paternalism and pity, then it is so much easier to build anything from a friendship to a working relationship to anything else. And by the way, this is not an Indigenous specific example, although this is the context in which I'm sharing it. This is for all humans. We all have something to teach, and we all have something to learn. All right. There's more to say about tribal economies and things like that. Native nations employ over 1 million people in this country, have a huge economic imprint. Cherokee Nation alone has a $3.8 billion annual budget. That's no joke. Right? Be nice to natives, probably end up working for one someday. I like Abigail Echo Hawk's quote. She said, "We are not a historically underserved population. My history is one of ancestors who survived so I could thrive. My history didn't start with Western civilization. I'm colonially underserved, I'm institutionally underserved, and I am historically resilient." In many ways, a lot of the atrocious things that happened in history, the genocides, the institution of slavery, the residential boarding schools, that's less a history of Black and brown people so much as a history of white colonial people. Surviving that stuff is Black and brown history. And so if we reframe a little bit, I think we were well served by our ancestors, well provided for, well looked after in incredibly difficult circumstances. It's just all the other stuff that came later that's been so mean. And we have the capacity, not just in us as Native people, but in everyone on this planet, to show up differently and better, to humanize one another, to treat each other right, to honor the creed of whatever religion or belief system or humanistic way that any human will espouse. Because a lot of people espouse golden rule kind of stuff and never live by it. But when we think about the things we do say we believe in and align with that, whatever it is, usually things go a lot better. All right. There's me as a tyke. My mom did her law degree in Washington, D.C. So we spent a few years going back and forth, always had her summers on the res. I got to code switch from being like a native to being the native. It was eye-opening. Yeah, a perspective builder. And both of my parents were on journeys of their own. My mother, I shared a little bit about her career stuff. She was also like, my grandmother had gone to residential boarding school, and my mom was on a relearning, reclaiming journey around language, culture, and other things too. And I was along for the ride. And my father was, starting and restarting his life. Seemed like he did that a few times. And there were humble beginnings. Although I never had my mom's experience of food scarcity or all you kids got to help put food on the table kind of stuff. I was well taken care of by my folks. But we did have a house with an outhouse and no electricity or running water. Wash up in the creek for a while. And then it changed. By the time I hit middle school, there's me washing up in the creek, scrubbing good. Yeah, By the time I hit middle school, my mom had a law degree, built a nice house, and the economic profile for our family changed. What you guys are doing, the students in this room, is something that is really important and powerful. And education is so powerful. In spite of the fact that our legislators went from 90% thinking a college education is worth it to 20% thinking a college education is worth it, which is ridiculous. The correlation between having a college degree and access to financial opportunity has never been tighter. Even though, and I tell this to my own children, there are 1,000 definitions of success. You can pick any one of them. And I do have kids who are doing every one of them you could probably imagine. There's my crew, 9 kids. Some of them are married and making babies and stuff like that. So one's working on a union construction job. A couple have gone to college. A couple are educators. They're doing all different kinds of things. And the degree that you are pursuing will pay you dividends for the rest of your life. It's like a huge set of tools in the toolbox. And when you have more tools, you are more adaptable to different kinds of work. And yeah, we got problems in higher ed too. You want to go there, we can talk about them. Too much debt. And not enough financial support externally. And for you, it's unconscionable that the wealthiest country in the world should saddle you with debt of any kind to get your degree. That's not right. And there's much more to say. But that correlation is real. And much more to say about that if you want. So there's the crew. It is never dull. We got 9 kids. We have 5 grandkids. It's never dull. I'm always hunting for sitters, y'all. No, I'm just kidding. We actually have 7 kids out the door and 2 to go. So our youngest ones are 14 and 16 right now. They are ridiculous. I like this Cornel West quote. He said, "We're not a nation of immigrants. We're a nation with immigrants." Also, with Indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans in its origin. By the way, that is not a dispositive list. In other words, it's not complete. It also includes indentured servants from Ireland and lots of other different folks. But that's the point. America's not one thing. I think sometimes that impulse to say we're all a nation of immigrants is a way to say, hey, we're all in it together, and people just aren't thinking about natives when they're saying it. It's good to think about that, because of course that could be marginalizing to Indigenous folks or to Black pain for those who have ancestors who didn't choose to come here voluntarily. All right, so we're going to open this up for questions. One quick story to kind of cue us up. So, and a couple of disclaimers. I finished high school with a plan that a lot of high schoolers come up with, and my plan was, I'm going to get out of town and never come back. And I got into Princeton University, and I thought, hooray! Not just because cool school, but I thought naively that there was a way to escape from the brambled racial borderland of my youth. Like, these people are going to be better educated, the ignorance will be behind me, this is going to be awesome. First person I met there said, dude, are you native? Where's your tomahawk? And I remember thinking, oh no, the brambled racial borderland is going to follow me everywhere I go, and these are the dumbest smart people I've ever met, and stuff like that. But I stayed. I had a great experience. My freshman year assigned roommate was a citizen of Sri Lanka, and we became best friends and roomed together 4 years in a row and best man at each other's weddings and all of that. I learned as much outside the classroom as in. I did get homesick. And at one point I heard that there was this woman, she was a Comanche spiritual leader who was coming out to Princeton, which is in New Jersey, to run sweat lodge ceremonies. And part of me is thinking, well, the Comanche people I've met come from Oklahoma or Texas. And why is somebody from there coming out to New Jersey to run a ceremony? Does this mean like have pipe will travel, culture for sale, or something like that? But being naive, I went to check it out. I thought, if this is anything like home, it'll be good. I went out there and there were surprises for me. So it was about 3 p.m, beautiful sunny day. Surprise number one, as there are 20 people waiting for the sweat lodge ceremony, surprise number one is they were all white. Surprise number two, they were all naked. And as I've come driving up, I have mixed feelings. So part of me wants to laugh because it is 20 naked people standing around in the woods in the broad daylight. Like, how's it going? How's it going? Like, oh my God, right? Like, what can you do? Part of me wants to run because like 20 naked people standing around in the woods, like, I'm out. And part of me's mad. Like, are you serious? Get naked, dance around a fire? Is that what you think native stuff is all about? Give me a break, But being naive, I stopped the car, shut it off, get out. I got folded into a tight embrace by one of these naked strangers who's now hugging me hard and saying, I'm so sorry what my people did to your people. And I'm like, awkward. Now the desire to like laugh, run, get mad is just growing. I looked at this woman's face. She was an elder, and there were tears welling up in her eyes. And it occurred to me that no matter how misguided she was, sure, she was misguided, her emotional response was sincere. And there's something that often happens to people from a minoritized group that doesn't always happen to everyone else as much, which is like you get asked to be a spokesperson for a whole group of people. Like people wouldn't ask, what do white people think about abortion, good or bad? Like we know it's complex and there's a diversity of opinions and emotionally charged ones and well, it's like that for everybody, from every group. And I'm usually thinking, I got a house full of natives. I don't even know what they're thinking most of the time. Like, honestly, I am just me. I'm one human being. And I'm all the things about me. I'm my age, I'm my gender, I'm where I grew up and how I grew up and like all this stuff. I can only represent one person. And at the same time, I thought, man, if I just get mad and let this woman have it, the only native she meets is an angry one. I'm reinforcing stereotypes. If I just walk away and let her think whatever she's thinking, not my problem, well, she will never have anything to help her challenge what she's thinking. So I had to think fast. And I said, ma'am, could you put some clothes on? Because I would love to talk to you about all of this. And she did. And we had a good talk. And I do think she learned a few things, but in a weird way, I did too. And one of the things I learned was that there is a value to doing our best to try to give a meaningful answer, not just an angry rebuke. And that most of us did not get enough information handed to us on any kind of silver platter. We've all been denied access to the right kinds of information. In some ways, that issue is amplified in our modern social media space, where the algorithm knows that there's something that sells better than sex, and it is rage. And we are all bombarded with rage bait all day long. It keeps us in an echo chamber, and it keeps us clicking and sharing. And it keeps us away from multiple perspectives, a more nuanced understanding of complex topics, and it keeps us away also often from the truth. So we have to be discerning, even though no one's making that stuff easy for us. So I started to save questions. Oh, there were all kinds of questions. Is it Indian, Native, Native American, Aboriginal, Indigenous, First Nation person, or what? And nothing like not even knowing what terminology is right to like immobilize a conversation. There were questions about what is tribal sovereignty? What does that mean? What do you think about casinos, good or bad? What's happening with Indigenous language revitalization? What do you think about pipelines? What do you think about mascots? There were so many different kinds of questions. Questions about history and all kinds of things. And then I realized I only knew my own life. And some things, as a matter of perspective, I could say, well, here's what it felt like for me when I went through this thing, or what I've seen. But honestly, my mom with a law degree, who eventually became a judge, like, I would have been really hard pressed to give a decent definition of tribal sovereignty by the time I'd finished high school. Being Native didn't mean that you knew all the things or how to explain them to anyone else. And if it's that tough for a Native person, imagine how tough it was for everybody else. So I started hunting for the answers. I'm still hunting. But that eventually turned into talks and turned into books and things like that. And I've been really heartened by the response to this work. I thought I was writing a book mainly for non-Native people who were curious at first, but Native people gave it such a warm reception, I think in part because we want to know too. And we get bombarded with a lot of the same questions. And it kind of just grew and grew from there. So I'll say that much to get us started. And you can start hitting me with the questions, and we will go until they cut me off and send you off at the end of your class period. Who wants to get me started? Yeah.
As far as debt with education, how do you feel about that? Money process.
Yeah, the debt financed higher education. I feel not good about that. Yeah, I think it is wrong. Well, I'll give you a few thoughts. And again, this is just me, my perspective, other people may think differently. I feel like there are blessings and detriments to every way of structuring a government, an economy, and things like that. One of the things that happens, like the problem with communism, for example, is that it uses the government to like reallocate things, and it puts a lot of power in the hands of the government, and that power can and often has been abused. Look across the ocean, Russia, China, right? In a capitalist system, it puts a lot of power in the hands of corporations. And they too abuse their power, manipulate people, and don't look out for the common good. And you can see, you don't even need to take my word for anything. You can see how the corporations are owning politicians and sculpting political agendas and squeezing ever more out of people. When you look over generations of evolution in a capitalist system, and I'm not like making a case for or against a particular system like as a utopia. I'm just pointing out some realities. Like, it used to be at a time like 1950, someone could graduate from high school and make enough money to like take care of a family of 6 people. There is no way that that is a practical expectation today, because the system has squeezed more out of people with each successive generation. And it's been done in so many ways, and this debt-financed higher education is one of the ways, although it's not the only way that that has happened. You will be expected to pay a higher percentage of your earnings on food than any generation before you, and a higher percentage on housing than any generation before you. It's why most people under the age of 30 in this country end up living with their parents for some significant part of their 20s. And that's just reality. So the debt financing just amplifies it all. It's like you do, in a high-tech world. Like, if you have not finished high school, the average annual income does not top $30,000 a year usually. And if you have a terminal degree, like a law degree, PhD, medical doctor, like, it's like 150. And you're most likely to marry someone else with similar credentials, 300,000. It's 10 times the earning power every year with compound interest over lifetimes. So getting the degree bumps you up to the next, at least the option. I can't guarantee you won't be working at Starbucks for a little while when you finish up at SMSU, but it's a tool that improves your chances of bumping up into the next layers with all those compound powers. It is worth it, but the debt financing of it, is like a huge tax on your real earning power and spending power. And in many ways, you can look at this whole system and structure as one that has burdened younger people ever more with this debt, like to the point where it takes some decades to be like free of it for many people. And they've done it in ways like with constant tax cuts and things like that, so that the people who are earning more money have reduced tax burdens, and the stock market's still going ba-doom, 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 but who can afford and owns the stocks? And so it accelerates the wealth disparities, and it taxes your ability to climb higher faster. So that's what I think is wrong. And frankly, a country this wealthy with like the per capita, GDP we have, can completely afford to have everybody who wants a college degree to do so with zero debt. And they should. And a lot of countries do. So I think it is immoral that they're not doing it that way. There are lots of people like in the educational systems who are trying to find ways to create more opportunities. And it's everything from like, scholarship fundraising to working on the systems. I think SMSU is like in-state tuition for everybody. And, they're trying to do the things that they can reasonably do to make it easier. But it's still like, it's like paddling your canoe upriver. Everyone's trying to milk sees you as a resource. Well, a lot of people, and certainly the corporations, will see you as a resource. There are a lot of your fellow citizens will see you as a human being and are going to advocate for you, but their power to like change the whole systems, is blunted. So that's the tension out there. But to me, it's pretty clear. I think, the policy decisions, they're varied. There are a lot of different ways it could be handled, but yeah, I think there's a lot to think about for how we orchestrate that. More than one way to make it easier and better. Good question. Any others? Yeah. Do you want to help run mics maybe? Just we'll put the questions over the mic just so everyone else can hear them. I don't know if that's on or not.
What are your thoughts on blood quantums and what it means to be a Native American?
Oh yeah, how much time do we have, y'all? Yeah, it's a great question. So for those who aren't familiar, maybe just a little bit of background, and then I'll drill right into this one. So first of all, Native American people are not just another racial or ethnic group within, the diversity in America. They have political entities, Native nations that were here before the United States even existed, have existed through all of US history and are still in existence to this day. And although there's more to say about ways in which the US government has tried to diminish and chip away at Indigenous sovereignty, it is still retained. Maybe one of the more obvious examples for you living in Marshall, Minnesota, is that the state of Minnesota says gaming and gambling is illegal except for pull tabs, Powerball, and church bingo. And those laws do not apply to Native nations who make their own laws about gaming and gambling, as well as a number of other things. So you can see that the sovereignty has, some obvious jurisdictional legal parameters. As a result, each Native nation sets its own criteria for who should be eligible to be a citizen of that Native nation. And like for the United States, I think most people understand if you are born here, you are eligible for citizenship in the United States of America, and then there is a process for others to become citizens that is complex and has variables. And obviously, both of those things have been questioned and under assault in recent political climates. But for Native nations, being born on the res is not what entitles you to citizenship. It is proving a certain percentage of blood in your veins that comes from an original tribal member. So you got to bear in mind there are 576 different federally recognized tribes, and each one makes its own rules. So it's not like one size fits all here, but most of the tribes require proving 25% of your blood comes from an original tribal member. Some, like Cherokee Nation or Red Cliff Ojibwe in Wisconsin, have changed it to say proving lineal descent from an original member. So there are some that have moved in that direction. Some, like Red Lake in northwestern Minnesota, declared everyone who was on the tribal rolls in 1958 a full blood, so it slightly expanded the tribal polity and the number of tribal enrolled members. But most have this requirement. It's highly problematic, but for a variety of reasons. And here, this is hotly debated inside Native communities. There is not universal agreement. I'll give you my perspective for whatever that's worth, but understand, first of all, not everyone has the same perspective. Short answer, I think we should dispense with tribal enrollment. I think it is highly flawed, and it's a big mistake for a whole variety of reasons. Not everyone will agree with me. The reasons include that the record keepers don't have all the records. So there are lots of people who do have blood or sufficient blood in their veins, but cannot document it within the system that's there. So if somebody has, like, of their 4 grandparents, if each of the 4 grandparents is a full blood, but each from a different tribe, they are 25% at any tribe. They marry somebody else, make a baby, that baby is not eligible for tribal enrollment. So there are lots of people who are excluded from the tribal polity just by that. We also have had 1/3 of Native kids adopted and fostered out of their communities and disconnected from their community and tribe of origin. And it is hard, especially if there's a sealed adoption, but even if it's not a sealed adoption, to get all of your stuff and, like, prove your case to the satisfaction of a system to become eligible for tribal citizenship. 70% of the Native population lives off reservation. We're all bumping into one another. I mentioned earlier how Native people have the highest rate of marriage to those from outside groups. All of these things are complicating things, and there are actually more Native people who are not eligible for tribal citizenship than there are eligible tribal citizens. And there are Native nations, like here in the state of Minnesota, Grand Portage, which is in the far northeastern part of the state, has only 80 children on the tribal rolls. If they do not change their criteria, there will soon be only 80 tribal members, and 70% will be living off the reservation. It is hard to say we are a bona fide Native nation when that happens. Also, if you just look, like, zoom out and look around the world, any country with declining birth rates has problems. And like in Italy right now, you can move to Italy. Anyone who's a US citizen at least can move to Italy, can be fast-tracked for citizenship in Italy, and can purchase a house in Italy for $1, as long as you agree to stay and fix it up, pay your taxes. And they cannot get people to move. And the number of Italian citizens is less every year. And with less people paying taxes, and lots of the population getting older, and lots of pensioners pulling in benefits, then the entire economic structure and system verges on collapse. And I think you would fairly say that Italy is less powerful relative to its neighbors than they were during the Roman Empire. And the same things are happening in Korea and in Japan and in lots of other places where there's a plateau and decline in birth rates, and there are profound economic and political disempowerments that are at stake. So if Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous economies are to be growing and ascendant, we should be welcoming our kids and grandkids into the ranks of enrolled tribal members. The Cherokee Nation did it, and they famously have 466,000 tribal members. Some of the economic things happen on a per capita basis, and they're able to scale things in a different way. Annual budget is $3.8 billion. That enables them to have a Cherokee language budget of $17 million a year. And they can do stuff. Even in the state of Oklahoma, where every single county votes Republican. Even swimming against those waters. So I think it is wise in economic and political empowerment perspectives to be growing and including and expanding our citizenry. I think it is also better aligned with our values as Indigenous people to love and look out for our kids and grandkids. And I think it is just morally problematic not to do those things. There is an argument against it. And the argument against it is, pretty soon we'll be enrolling anybody who's ever seen a Native who's busy hunting for a scholarship, and it'll divide the resources we have available for those who stayed here to keep the language and culture alive. And I hear those arguments. The fear is real, but what you're really hearing is fear of scarcity and competition over resources. It is amplified if a tribe happens to have a per capita payment from a casino, because you're asking existing members to vote for something that will dilute a financial benefit that they are receiving every year. But it's our kids and grandkids. Come on. So I think there are ways to mitigate some of those concerns. You could have a residency requirement for those who hold tribal office. You could limit the focus of your housing program to houses on the reservation. There are lots of things that can be done, but I do think, in my view, we should be expansive about it, and thoughtful and inclusive and kind. And that is something that would be way more recognizable to our ancestors than vocabulary words they never knew, like blood quantum, tribal ID card, enrollment. They didn't have those words. My view. All right. Other questions? Yes.
Colleges like Minnesota Morris that offer. How do you feel about colleges like Morris that offer free tuition to anyone that can prove even a drop of Native blood?
Yeah, so I'm aware that Morris has a tuition waiver for Native students, and I support that. Yeah. Got to bear in mind, Morris got a land grant, right? Land that really has a troubled history of how it was wrested from Indigenous hands. And it is a minor, truly minor act towards restorative justice to make that offering. I mean, you heard me earlier. I think all of you should be going to school for free, but this particular effort in that particular place, I think is aligned with their values. and also provides an opportunity for us to practice at restoring relationships and trying to address historical injustice. And I don't think that's the only thing that should be happening, but I do think that particular thing should be happening. And I understand that, like, within the United States of America, there's this kind of barometer that a lot of people have because we're so libertarian, or at least espoused to be, that it's not fair if someone has different hunting rights or different fishing rights, or someone's getting, a tuition-free educational opportunity in Morris and I'm not, right? Doesn't sound fair. But bear in mind, like, there are over 100 treaties out of 400. Over 100 have education clauses and health clauses that said, essentially, as partial payment for land sold, we promise to provide for the education and health of all parties, as mentioned heretofore, as long as grasses grow and rivers flow. So many treaties have said this. Collectively, it's part of what is known as the U.S. federal government's trust responsibility to Native nations. The reason there's an Indian Health Service and a Bureau of Indian Education is not a special right for a special interest group. That is partial payment for land sold. And if anyone wants to revisit the treaties, please bring it on, because we have lawyers now. But if not, and people want to keep all of the land that they claim to own all over this whole country, then great nations, like great human beings, should honor their word. I'm getting ranty, you guys. Other questions? Everything's fair game. Yeah.
So you talked about the importance of seeing people like you when you were growing up. When you were growing up, what do you recall about seeing people like you in movies or TV shows or books? And what did you see and what did that mean to you?
Yeah, I didn't see an awful lot. And what I saw was largely pretty problematic. I mean, I'm 56, and things have shifted and changed a lot and continue to evolve. And I think it'll be even better, another 50 or 100 years from now. But yeah, it was like spaghetti westerns, Native people were pretty nameless, usually getting killed by John Wayne kind of stuff, There were a few things that were starting to pop up, like, Billy Jack came out, which is like the first movie that showed a Native person kicking a non-Native person's butt, and I was like, cool. Yeah. I got a friend, his kid's named Billy Jack, because, Billy Jack. But so there were some things, and that movie came out in the 70s. But there's been so much more now. And I think most of the books too, like there was a lot of kind of trauma porn out there, or it's like maybe Dustin Hoffman, Little Big Man, but it's a lot of Native massacre scenes. And then there's like the white dude playing the Native part, for the sympathetic Native. You saw, and I mean, I was like probably a senior in college when Dances with Wolves came out. And that was a big change to be more sympathetic and trying to be a little more accurate. Although that movie had plenty of problems too, which included like some stereotypes about good Natives, bad Natives, put them into neat categories. The white dude is still better at being Native than the Natives, and, lots of other things. So it was like a step, but even that one, like, which had plenty of problems we can see and point to, within 2 years, there were 400 Native people in the major acting guild in Hollywood. Like it also had some really positive rippling effects. So it was a mixed bag. But in recent years, I mean, we got Native creators who are writing, producing, and acting, and it continues to evolve. So Reservation Dogs, which has a couple of Bemidji kids who were, one is an actor and one is one of the screenwriters. And then lots of other things too. They're a Native director for the Indigenous Predator movie and things like that. even though, you know, it's a Predator movie. But still, you know, we continue to evolve. And I think we need to have some room and freedom for everyone to participate in the enterprise. Like, you know, there were Native people who would have been happy to do the movie on the Osage, Killers of the Flower Moon. But they did have Native actors and support and endorsement from a tribal government and things like that. Even though, you know, Leonardo DiCaprio is getting pretty centered and Martin Scorsese probably made most of the money. You know, so like we take steps and we have many more steps to take. Yeah, and I think it makes a difference. We should have everything, like everything. There should be, and this is, I know there's a cool TED Talk if you guys want a little homework to do, maybe back in your classes. Go on YouTube and look for the danger of a single story. It's a great TED Talk. It's, you know, I don't know, 12, 15 minutes. And Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is the speaker. She's a Nigerian literary figure. And she has a great little perspective where she says, you know, the problem with stereotypes is not so much that they're incorrect as much as they're incomplete. And they give you a narrow little single story to understand a whole group of people. And, you know, like if you wanted to do something, for example, like study white people, a lot of people do it, by the way. It's a very common enterprise. But if you did, and you only looked at stories of white poverty and rural white Appalachia and thought, oh, those poor people, what happened to the white family? You know, oh, the meth. I wouldn't tell you everything you need to know about being white in America. I wouldn't even tell you what you need to know about being white in Appalachia. It's a stereotype, right? Doesn't mean there aren't some stories that will confirm that stereotype, but it's a single story. And the same thing if you only studied like wealthy white people on New York's Upper East Side and thought, wow, everything handed on a silver platter. Also wouldn't tell you everything you need to know. But if you did study like white folk in America, like you don't get a single story. You get so many stories. Look at the movies. There's like white guys who are good guys. There's white guys who are bad guys. There's white guys who are good guys, Breaking Bad, and there's a whole series about it. And there's, you know, there's white guys who are like bad guys turning good. Like look at Jamie Lannister in Game of Thrones. And as a result, you can even watch a show like Psycho and you're not like, white people run. But if you were to study natives, you'll see more movies about aliens than Native Americans. And most of the stuff out there, you know, has usually reinforced a stereotype of, you know, poverty, trauma. Even 87% of educational standards that mention Native anything are stories from before 1900. You know, it reinforces the idea that we're something that happened in the past, as opposed to thousands of years of human history still in the making. You know, so I think the efforts to change that are really welcome and positive, and can just give us more information. I mean, even an event like this just gives us a chance to bump into each other, and, you know, even if they don't remember anything I said, they'll just remember there was a Native dude there talking, you know, and he had a really cool medallion, and there was a collar on his shirt, right? Or whatever. Yeah.
So that was loud. I wanted to say that in the spirit of that, you know, where are we bumping into people? I know one of the things that I've heard advised by particularly Black women is follow creators to understand more about communities you don't know. I know I follow you on TikTok. I particularly liked your video about Aurora Borealis. I appreciated that perspective very much. Are there any Indigenous creators, particularly Ojibwe, Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, or other nations around us that you would suggest from your experience on TikTok or other platforms?
Oh,
or
yeah.
Instagram Reels for those professors in the room.
Facebook, hey. Yeah, so yes, there are many, and I think it's cool to like just be curious and see who and what speaks to you, and not leave it all up to the algorithm gods to make all the determinations. Couple things, you know, that might be helpful for folks to find things. I have lists of like a curated list of Indigenous authored books. It's free. It's on the website. There's a YouTube channel. And aside from the things that I'm spouting all the time, I'm usually pointing people to some of the other folks out there. And it kind of depends on what part of the work you're most interested in. But yeah, like I'm not the only guy even doing an Ojibwe word of the day. There are a few other people out there who are doing some really cool work in that space. There are, like if you're interested in the movies and modern media kind of stuff, Sterling Harjo is putting a lot of content out there. Migizi Pensino is maybe not as regular of a poster, but he's one of the screenwriters that worked on Reservation Dogs. Dallas Goldtooth, who actually officiates at the Sundance down at Morton and was an actor in Reservation Dogs and is very active in social media. He posts constantly and has a huge following. Those are some of the folks that just immediately jump to mind, but there are many, many other people who are sharing content out there, and see who else they're bumping into and sharing things with and about, and it'll kind of get the ball rolling. Yeah. 2 minutes, y'all. You got one last one? Short one? Yeah.
So as educators that are going into education in Minnesota, the standards that require lesson plans about Native American history, how do we as people that are not Native, or a lot of us that are not Native, go about integrating that into our classrooms without coming off as like appropriating or giving information that we don't know enough about?
All right, great question. And for those who don't know, like there's been a huge overhaul in the Minnesota educational standards. They're asking science teachers to speak about Indigenous bodies of knowledge and ways of knowing. They're asking, to teach Minnesota Indigenous authored books in the ELA side of things. There's, asking, instead of talking about Native people as another racial or ethnic group, what are Native nations and how do they work here in Minnesota? So these are unfunded mandates. And there are a couple of topics that bump up, like what's appropriate and what's cultural appropriation. And so I'll offer a couple thoughts. First of all, there's no way for anyone to be a content expert on all the stuff you got to teach. So, but we are conditioned to think we got to be a content expert before we can open our mouth or say anything. So I think learning how to frame things as, all right, we're going to try a new unit here. I'm going to ask a couple big guiding questions. I'm going to ask you to answer these questions. And I'm going to coach your learning effort instead of, I'm just going to tell you what's up. So, and by the way, that's a pretty healthy way to learn. It could be even a big guiding question like, what is photosynthesis? But it includes, like I have a kid who's going to an expeditionary school and they had a unit on Columbus, and it helps you navigate culture wars and politically testy K-12 spaces and stuff too. Cause like, I don't know, they had a put Columbus on trial thing and every kid wrote their own court opinion and no one was graded on their opinion. They were graded on their ability to use that venue to show their knowledge of geography, historical things, and whatever else. And so the teacher didn't have to say like, this guy's right, that one's wrong. It's like, you have to put a coherent argument together and back it up with facts. So what you got, right? And so it's a little different that way. In my view, with regard to cultural appropriation, I would say this, there's some stuff that is super safe. So as a general rule, Native-led is really safe, right? If a Native person says, buy my art, buy the art. If a Native person says, eat my food, eat the food. If a Native person says, come to the powwow, go to the powwow. If a Native person says, read my book, go ahead, read the book. Like it's all super safe, right? And on the other end, the Native inspired is problematic. The Boy Scout Order of the Arrow put on pretend war paint and call it an overnight fast, and now you're a Native and here's your Native name. More problematic, thinner ice. In between are the gray areas. And I think as a general rule, like for your educational practice, the more you can pull in some of those native voices, the easier it will be for you to navigate. And it doesn't mean that you have to like have someone come in and be your brain and be your voice when the unit pops up, but it can be a YouTube short. It can be a video, it can be a piece of art, it can be, and of course, if you get a real live breathing human being, like that's awesome. But, there are lots of ways to integrate perspectives and stuff like that into your educational practice. Also, we have to have some freedom to do some stuff. Otherwise, only men could write about men, only women could write about women. Like, it starts getting pretty silly pretty quick if we cannot be curious and empowered to teach and learn about one another. In fact, it's a healthy practice to teach and learn about one another. You're going to be in mixed company most of your lives. The kids you teach will be in mixed company most of their lives. Teaching them how to do that, with comfort begins with you showing some comfort and just stepping forward and doing the brave things. And I think some of the things that can be helpful can also be, depending on where you're working and who's there, just reaching out to your native stakeholders. You might have a, native person who's on staff working in the Indian Ed office whose job is to be a curricular consultant with you. Talk to that person. You don't have one, don't give up. So you got a native parent committee, work with them. You got people who are writing things like Shakopee funded, with $5 million of funding, a whole bunch of guidance for Minnesota educators on how to meet those curricular guidelines and recommended resources and best practices, all kinds of stuff. So I would say incorporate that, step forward, try to use some sonar, sound waves going out, sound waves coming back, constant conversation with native people who are doing things in that space, and be brave, lean in. We need you to bring up the topics and teach about the things, no matter your background. We are always going to have someone who is not from our background, and we certainly wouldn't want to only teach whiteness. We want to teach all the things. So yeah, it means, sometimes a little bit out of the comfort zone, but that's a good place to be. That's where the growth happens. Let's go. Hey, and I'm probably in your classroom at some point. I can mention too for follow-ups, there's cards on the table. I've got free educator guides on all of my books. Free educator guides for a number of other things. There are Ojibwe and Dakota educators who worked on why treaties matter. There's lots of stuff. So you can just click the links, go to resources, and there's tons of stuff that you can poke around and take a look at. All right, we're hitting the clock. I know some of you got to fly, but I want to thank you for all the great questions. And remember, we've got an event this evening, and you're all invited to that one too. Miigwech, thank you.